everyone and welcome! There was a Nexus post I skipped in our last Rift news. That's because I found that post far more interesting than the rest. So instead, today I want to talk about it in its own separate video. The post I am referring to is called Naming New Champions, and it was written by Riot Banana Bandit. The reason why this post is so interesting to me is because it talks about a topic Riot has never talked about before. We have never heard a thing about decisions on official champion names. And this is not limited to League of Legends. Their reasoning is used in books, movies and other games as well. So this post can expand your understanding of fictional names in general. So finally, let's have a look at how the picking process goes. The post starts by telling us whose job it is to pick names. Narrative writers are the primary people tasked with giving League's champions their names. It's a process that starts on day one, and it involves a lot of research, name storming and rejection, from both the narrative writers themselves, the champion team and localization. But in the end, there's guaranteed to be only one name left standing. Now let's have a look at some of the problems when it comes to the first name iterations. Naming really begins once the general direction for champions' art, fantasy and personality are decided. You're always thinking about the name, or putting off thinking about the name, says narrative writer Michael Cool Radius McCarthy. Even when it temporarily evades your thought, considering names becomes unavoidable once it's time to start working on story sketches. Story sketches are the narrative version of concept art. Writers create short stories about the new champion to explore and define their personality. We'll try to put some names into the story sketch just to see how it feels, says Odin Wargbubbo Scheffer. Does it work at all, or is it just weird? Sharing these story sketches with the rest of the team can get tricky. What do you call a champion who doesn't have a name? One thing writers try to avoid, both in story sketches and beyond, is giving the champion a temporary name because sometimes it becomes permanent. Temp names have a tendency to take over, says Ariel Thermal Kitten Lawrence. People will become so attached to it that it becomes impossible for them to let go. There is even an example of a temporary name that stuck with the character in this post. Kindred is an example of a temporary name that turned permanent, but that was only after exploring lots of other options. The team decided Kindred was the best fit for the character because it invoked dark fairy tale vibes, one of the goals for the champion, and was combination of kin and dread. Some techniques writers use to avoid naming champions too early include giving them a temp name no one can pronounce. Wargbubbo often uses Aztec names in the story sketches because almost nobody on the team can pronounce them. If you ask me, that's quite ironic given Wargbubbo's name. I'll use something like Zli, and people will come to me like, how do you say this? And I'm like, exactly. Second option is give them god-awful temp name. I try to create a working name that's so ridiculous that nobody will try to pick it, says Matthew Fox Chiseldoon. If I do it well, everyone will be like, please, we really need a new name. For example, Aurelian Souls was Heaven's Coil. The third option is to stick with the name being used for gameplay design. This method can be convenient, but oftentimes that name ends up sticking around. It has a lot of influence on their personality and frequently turns into their title, says Thermal Kitten. For example, I referred to Talia as Stoneweaver for a long time, and that's her title now. Now, let's have a look at how their real names are picked. Before brainstorming names, narrative writers sit down and decide on the goals. There are some universal rules that apply to most names, such as that names should be pretty easy to say, Ilaoi was an exception, but in addition to those general guidelines, there are usually 3 to 5 champion-specific goals, listed in order of importance. For example, the goals for Camille's name were evokes aristocratic eccentricity, should give a picture of a proper Piltovan lady, should be attractive sounding but not beautiful sounding, distinctly feminine, and can be shortened to a nickname if it's too long. These goals help narrative writers and the rest of the champion team judge whether the potential names are a good fit. Sometimes we'll share names with the team and everyone will be all in on a name, but one person objects with passion. My sister's ex-boyfriend was a jerk and he was named Zeragheimer. No way! Pick a new one, says Cool Radius. This is why having the goals agreed upon ahead of time is so important. It gives us a better way to measure whether the name is a good fit for the champion. There are also some general considerations that apply to all champion names, including what's the most abbreviated version of the name, and does that version still meet the goals? Is it easy to pronounce in most languages we localize to? A good test for this is to imagine shoutcasters yelling it. Is it pronounced how it looks? Otherwise it's going to be constant struggle of correcting people. Veigar or Veigar? Cassiopeia or Cassiopeia? Although there is a workaround for this one. Almost all of the new champions say their own name in-game. Examples: I'm Ilawi and I'm here to test you.
My name is Alawi.
Or, hi, I'm Zoe.
Hi, my name is Zoe.
Does it look interesting and feel nice to say? Are there any other champions with names that sound similar? This is generally something to avoid because each champion should be unique, plus it gets confusing. Now, how does name storming usually turn out? Once the goals are set, narrative writers come up with a list of potential names. The number of names that end up on that list depends on the champion and who the writer is. But usually it is around 100 to 200. Sometimes the original list can have over 500 names, but that's usually only when spelling variations are included. Baby name books and websites are often a good place to start, but the names that make it on the list usually don't come directly from a book. One of the goals for champion names is for them to stand out and be unique in League's universe, says Vargbabo. Something like Becky doesn't really work. Yes, Caitlyn exists. League and Riot were a little different back then. Ilawi was one of the names where early exploration started with referencing naming databases, but none of her potential names were taken from those sources. One of the goals for Ilawi's name was for it to sound exotic, which isn't usually the intention, but because Ilawi is from a faraway island nation in Runeterra, it made sense for her character. Vargbabo looked at what naming conventions were like in ancient Polynesian, ancient Australian, and ancient Greek languages, along with Hawaiian and Latin. I looked for what the languages share, what are the common letters, what letters don't they use, says Vargbabo. For example, double L's were common, and the letter V was basically non-existent, but the sound could be made in other ways. From there, it's a matter of grinding out names that follow that long list of rules. Some other names created include Ilwara, Iluka, Iolu, Yautl, and Yutu. Sometimes naming champions starts with research. I tend to read books that will enhance my understanding and help me get invested in what their world is like, says Fogchisel. For Ornn, I read a lot about volcanoes and Norse mythology. Research can also mean tracking down the origin of a name. If there's a name I like but I'm not sure what spelling I want to use, I might track back the language thread to its root in Latin or Arabic and see how to incorporate it, says Thermalkitten. That helps me create a giant list that I will then narrow down. Another approach to naming champions is to dive deep into the naming conventions of the region they are from. The rules for the region, if they are written down at all, are intentionally vague because languages are pretty flexible, says Vargbabo. As a general rule, Targonian names sound very Hellenic, Greek or Roman, in both syllables and meaning. Void names are ancient Shuriman in origin, which is separate from modern Shuriman, and usually contains two parts separated by an apostrophe. Yordle names tend to have double letters, sound friendly, and are pretty simple except for Heimerdinger. One other starting point for name storming is to look at the list of League champions in alphabetical order and identify which first letters are missing or almost missing from the roster. The goal here is to create a name that both fits the champion and starts with one of these underrepresented letters. Creating restrictions like this one can help the creativity flowing, even if you don't go in that direction, says Cool Radius. Oftentimes, the final name doesn't fill in the letter gap, which is partially because the letters themselves carry weight. For example, there's a reason why I doesn't have many names. It's an exotic sounding letter. It doesn't evoke Yordle. K feels punchy and aggressive, which is what we wanted for Kayn. It also might be a reason why there are so many K champions in general. R feels very appropriate for someone like Rakan. He's very confident and suave, like a rock star. And his top 3 names all started with R. I don't know why it's true, but other names didn't feel as suave. There are also letters which writers actively try to avoid. Q is problematic. In general, Asia will pronounce it one way, and Europe will pronounce it in a very different way. R and L are also problematic because they are difficult to pronounce in some regions. Being aware of when you're making a name harder to pronounce and for what percentage of players is important. So, what happens next in the process? The writers cut down their lists to about 25 to 100 names. If there is still a lot of them, they will often bolt their personal top 10. Then it's time to send them off to the rest of the champion team for thoughts and feels. And there are usually a lot of thoughts and feels. Everyone has an opinion about names, which is why it's so important to try to capture the team's goals ahead of time, says Foxhizzle. People on the champion team will share which names they like and which ones they don't. Sometimes they can agree on the top contenders directly from that list. Other times, not so much. You'll come up with a bunch of names that you think work, and you'll do a bunch of research, but sometimes none of them feel right, says Foxhizzle. If that happens, writers usually look at the names people like the most, try to find what they have in common, and then use that to come up with a new list of names. If everyone can agree on a top 10-ish, then it's time to send them off to localization. Writers in other regions will look at these names and tell the team whether any of them mean something terrible, or just plain weird in other languages. Each name either gets a yes, a maybe, or an absolutely not. And here we got a funny spreadsheet of some names translated in other regions. You can see that Brazil may be running into issues as everything can be translated into something related to ass. Also, if you have a closer look at these names, it is obvious that these were the name variations for Kane. So, he could have been Quo, Kuo, Tokata, Takata, Tekata, Yukura, Yukura, Kane with a C, and Kane with an I. I actually wonder what difference does Y and I make in the name Kane, and I wonder if it was just a matter of preference. Yes names are good to go, nothing weird happening there. Maybe names are not offensive, but they're just kind of strange. For example, Camille sounded a lot like camel in a couple of languages, and one of Rakan's alternative names meant hamster bottle. Thermal Kitten says, those are the times you have to decide. Is this offensive or not? And for how many players? Does the way the name fits the champion overweigh the maybe concerns? The absolutely nots are reserved for names that translate into swear words, slurs, and other profanity. Sometimes you'll have this name you really like, and then it turns out it means balls, says Foxhizzle. This is not a hypothetical example. Zaya's name was originally Zaya. The name made it through the normal localization process. But then the team later found out it's a medical word for testicles in Azerbaijani, a language spoken in the country Azerbaijan. I ran Zaya through a Google image search, and sure enough, there was a formal diagram, says Foxhizzle. I was like, well, this isn't ideal. Zaya was changed to Zaya and all was good in the world. Nowadays it's much more common to run the top names through multiple types of Google searches. And now to the final calls. Localization can sometimes cut the number of options down to only 2 or 3. And usually at this point there are only a few contenders left anyway. Then it comes to making the final decision. The best case scenario is for everyone on the team to just agree on which name is the best fit. This doesn't always happen. The DNA group, which includes the gameplay designer, narrative designer, and concept artist, have the strongest voice for which name we go with, says Wargbabo. Although personally, once we're down to the top 10, I'm happy with any of them. Usually the rest of the team can be persuaded to rally their support behind one name. If there's ever a lot of disagreement, which is rare, the team will turn to you and say, "We trust you as a writer, what do you think?" says Foxhizzle. Which is great, but then you're like, oh gosh, that one? And then you run away. And here is probably the most interesting part of this post. At the very end we got bunch of goals for different champions and unedited name storms for Jhin and Ornn. Let's start with the name storms. If you want, you can download the documents from the post yourselves. The goals for Deadeye, who turned into Jin, were Ionian and clearly from the same region as Zed and Shen. Short, punchy. Pronounceable, approachable, easily learned. Though Ionian, this name should not feel overly exotic. Bonus, formal and pretentious. Then there's a list of 50 names. From these 50, 11 got favorited. It is interesting that originally Jin was spelled J-I-N, and in Chinese it meant gold, but it was also a name in a half a dozen languages. What's also interesting that Jin's first name, Kada, was also on the list, but here it had a few different variations. Kada, Kata and Kata. Surprisingly, the name Kada, spelled K-H-A-D-A as we know it right now, wasn't even among the favorited on this list. There are also 2 lists of Jin's potential titles and his gun names. And below that there is a detailed guide on how these names were created. There is even a guide on how different letters sound in Ionian. Orn also had his own guide on letters and syllables from Nordic mythology. Orn's work-in-progress name was Living Forge, and he also got a lot of iterations. Strangely enough, the name Orn, as we know it right now, isn't anywhere in this name storm, but there are a lot of names that end with on and un, since it sounds very Nordic. I'm actually surprised that the final name doesn't start with Y. Jarl, Jothun, Uor, Yor. All those fit the mythos really well. But before I close this, I really want to mention a funny quote Fox Chisel left in the document. Tossed out Q, since no fucking Icelandic sounding name is gonna have a Q. And now, in the last part of this post, let's quickly go through the name goals and the name iterations for some of the champions. Camille is supposed to represent a proper Piltover lady. It should sound attractive but not beautiful, and it can be shortened to a nickname if long. Her names were Ariadne, shortened to Ari, which is basically Ari, Evangeline or Emmeline, too similar to Evelyn, and Beatrice or Beatrix, too similar to Swain's Raven. Talia had to evoke nomadic, tribal or desert culture. It had to feel like a family name, and it had to be short, but a long name is fine if it has a built-in nickname. Her names were Maya, sounds exactly like M-I-A, and Maya is Mia would sound weird. Tara, sounds like the word fetish in Brazilian Portuguese. Talea, spelling changed to Talia because Talea is a brand of bottled water in Russia. Zaya was focused on sounding good in a duo, as Zaya and Rakan. Olala, pronunciation will sound like oh la la in French, which is used in several European countries to say you are surprised or disappointed, with a hint of being silly. Zaya sounds very close to Zaira in some regions. Elascu, last syllable means ass in Brazilian Portuguese. Also, a personal side note, the Elcasu are the desert goats of Shurima, so I'm glad they avoided it. Kane had to sound powerful and quick with punchy syllables. Quo, a sound chicken makes in Czech. To be honest, as a Czech person I didn't even realize it, so it made me laugh. It's also a slang insult in Thai, and it means asshole in Brazilian Portuguese. Yukura also sounds like ass in Brazilian Portuguese. Mofa sounds close to mofo, which could get a little memey. Rast was supposed to be focused on X's and Y's to follow Aatrox. Zamiel, hard to pronounce. Zamul, can relate to vulgar words in French, and is hard to pronounce. Drakes, similar to Darius in Chinese. We already saw Orn, but he's basically all about the Norse mythology. Panapum, doesn't sound gruff or manly in many regions. Pum means fart in Brazilian Portuguese. Rum, pig sound in Polish. Start of an engine in Russian. Sounds like clearing throat in Greek and French. Also hard to pronounce. Hook, onomatopoeia for surprise in Korea. Glad had to sound short, unsophisticated and hillbilly-ish. Kag means trash or noob in Thai. Sounds like to shit in Brazilian Portuguese. Gorn sounds like horn or furnace in Russian, but mostly just wasn't the chosen one. Decay sounds like dick in multiple regions. Skarl was supposed to sound like a hillbilly name Kled would give him. Deek, same problem as Decay. Jaga means to care for or protect in Malay. Glorft, hard to pronounce in some regions. also sounds kind of gross, like the sound of throwing up, which I personally think would be appropriate. Zoe was relatively simple. It had to be easy to say, sound like a girly name, and a bit Targonian with Arabic influence. Nico, common boy's name in many regions. Sophie, sounds like cow in Bahasa. It is a sanitary napkin brand in Thailand. Sefi, sounds like a Turkish word for naive, which doesn't fit her character. And that's where the names end. To finish this video, let me quickly mention that before the big story rework, Riot had a very different taste in names. Usually it was all about referencing something. For example, Nocturne is an obvious reference to being nocturnal. Lee Sin, a traditional Chinese name combined with his sin. But there were even some clever and hidden references, like Tryndamere being the co-CEO of Riot Games, and Ashe being his wife Ashley. Also, they mentioned that Targonian names are related to Greek mythology, which made me realize that Pantheon, Leona and Diana are absolutely related to Pantheon, Leonidas and Dionysus. But that's pretty much it for this video. So if you enjoyed it, feel free to like it and subscribe for more lore and news. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Discord if you'd like to chat. Our merch and P.O. Box is in the description. Of course, special thanks to our patrons for going the extra mile. And with that, thank you all so much for being here and for your support, you know I really appreciate it. And as always, thank you come again.